Chapter 51. Ernest had been ordained to a curacy in one of the central parts of London. He hardly knew anything of London yet, but his instincts drew him thither. The day after he was ordained he entered upon his duties, feeling much as his father had done when he found himself boxed up in the carriage with Christina on the morning of his marriage. Before the first 3 days were over, he became aware that the light of the happiness which he had known during his 4 years at Cambridge had been extinguished, and he was appalled by the irrevocable nature of the step which he now felt that he had taken much too hurriedly. The most charitable excuse that I can make for the vagaries which it will now be my duty to chronicle is that the shock of change consequent upon his becoming suddenly religious, being ordained and leaving Cambridge, had been too much for my hero, and had for the time thrown him off an equilibrium which was yet little supported by experience, and therefore as a matter of course unstable. Everyone has a mass of bad work in him which he will have to work off and get rid of before he can do better, and indeed, the more lasting a man's ultimate good work is, the more sure he is to pass through a time, and perhaps a very long one, in which there seems very little hope for him at all. We must all sow our spiritual wild oats. The fault I feel personally disposed to find with my godson is not that he had wild oats to sow, but that they were such an exceedingly tame and uninteresting crop. The sense of humor and tendency to think for himself, of which till a few months previously he had been showing fair promise, were nipped as though by a late frost, while his earlier habit of taking on trust everything that was told him by those in authority, and following everything out to the bitter end, no matter how preposterous, returned with redoubled strength. I suppose this was what might have been expected from anyone placed as Ernest now was, especially when his antecedents are remembered, but it surprised and disappointed some of his cooler-headed Cambridge friends who had begun to think well of his ability. To himself it seemed that religion was incompatible with half measures, or even with compromise. Circumstances had led to his being ordained. For the moment he was sorry they had, but he had done it and must go through with it. He therefore set himself to find out what was expected of him, and to act accordingly. His rector was a moderate high churchman of no very pronounced views, an elderly man who had had too many curates not to have long since found out that the connection between rector and curate, like that between employer and employed in every other walk of life, was a mere matter of business. He had now 2 curates, of whom Ernest was the junior. The senior curate was named Prior, and when this gentleman made advances, as he presently did, Ernest in his forlorn state was delighted to meet them. Prior was about 28 years old. He had been at Eton and at Oxford. He was tall, and passed generally for good-looking. I only saw him once for about 5 minutes, and then thought him odious both in manners and appearance. Perhaps it was because he caught me up in a way I did not like. I had quoted Shakespeare for lack of something better to fill up a sentence, and had said that one touch of nature made the whole world kin. "Ah," said Prior, in a bold, brazen way which displeased me, "but one touch of the unnatural makes it more kindred still," and he gave me a look as though he thought me an old bore and did not care 2 straws whether I was shocked or not. Naturally enough, after this I did not like him. This, however, is anticipating, for it was not till Ernest had been 3 or 4 months in London that I happened to meet his fellow curate, and I must deal here rather with the effect he produced upon my godson than upon myself. Besides being what was generally considered good-looking, he was faultless in his get-up, and altogether the kind of man whom Ernest was sure to be afraid of and yet be taken in by. The style of his dress was very high church, and his acquaintances were exclusively of the extreme high church party, but he kept his views a good deal in the background in his rector's presence, and that gentleman, though he looked askance on some of Prior's friends, had no such ground of complaint against him as to make him sever the connection. Prior, too, was popular in the pulpit, and, take him all round, it was probable that many worse curates would be found for one better. When Prior called on my hero, as soon as the 2 were alone together, he eyed him all over with a quick penetrating glance and seemed not dissatisfied with the result, for I must say here that Ernest had improved in personal appearance under the more genial treatment he had received at Cambridge. Prior, in fact, approved of him sufficiently to treat him civilly, and Ernest was immediately won by anyone who did this. It was not long before he discovered that the High Church party, and even Rome itself, had more to say for themselves than he had thought. This was his first snipe-like change of flight. Prior introduced him to several of his friends. They were all of them young clergymen, belonging as I have said to the highest of the High Church school, but Ernest was surprised to find how much they resembled other people when among themselves. This was a shock to him. It was ere long a still greater one to find that certain thoughts which he had warred against as fatal to his soul, and which he had imagined he should lose once for all on ordination, were still as troublesome to him as they had been. He also saw plainly enough that the young gentlemen who formed the circle of Prior's friends were in much the same unhappy predicament as himself. This was deplorable. The only way out of it that Ernest could see was that he should get married at once. But then he did not know anyone whom he wanted to marry. He did not know any woman, in fact, whom he would not rather die than marry. It had been one of Theobald's and Christina's main objects to keep him out of the way of women, and they had so far succeeded that women had become to him mysterious, inscrutable objects to be tolerated when it was impossible to avoid them, but never to be sought out or encouraged. As for any man loving, or even being at all fond of any woman, he supposed it was so, but he believed the greater number of those who professed such sentiments were liars. Now, however, it was clear that he had hoped against hope too long, and that the only thing to do was to go and ask the first woman who would listen to him to come and be married to him as soon as possible. He broached this to Prior, and was surprised to find that this gentleman, though attentive to such members of his flock as were young and good-looking, was strongly in favor of the celibacy of the clergy, as indeed were the other demure young clerics to whom Prior had introduced Ernest. Chapter 52. "You know, my dear Pontifex," said Prior to him, some few weeks after Ernest had become acquainted with him, when the two were taking a constitutional one day in Kensington Gardens, "you know, my dear Pontifex, it is all very well to quarrel with Rome, but Rome has reduced the treatment of the human soul to a science, while our own Church, though so much purer in many respects, has no organized system either of diagnosis or pathology. I mean, of course, spiritual diagnosis and spiritual pathology. Our Church does not prescribe remedies upon any settled system, and, what is still worse, even when her physicians have according to their lights ascertained the disease and pointed out the remedy, she has no discipline which will ensure its being actually applied. If our patients do not choose to do as we tell them, we cannot make them. Perhaps really under all the circumstances this is as well, for we are spiritually mere horse doctors as compared with the Roman priesthood, nor can we hope to make much headway against the sin and misery that surround us, till we return in some respects to the practice of our forefathers and of the greater part of Christendom." Ernest asked in what respects it was that his friend desired a return to the practice of our forefathers. "Why, my dear fellow, can you really be ignorant? It is just this: either the priest is indeed a spiritual guide, as being able to show people how they ought to live better than they can find out for themselves, or he is nothing at all, he has no raison d'être. If the priest is not as much a healer and director of men's souls as a physician is of their bodies, what is he? The history of all ages has shown, and surely you must know this as well as I do, that as men cannot cure the bodies of their patients if they have not been properly trained in hospitals under skilled teachers, so neither can souls be cured of their more hidden ailments without the help of men who are skilled in soulcraft, or in other words, of priests. What do one half of our formularies and rubrics mean if not this? How in the name of all that is reasonable can we find out the exact nature of a spiritual malady, unless we have had experience of other similar cases? How can we get this without express training? At present we have to begin all experiments for ourselves, without profiting by the organized experience of our predecessors, inasmuch as that experience is never organized and coordinated at all. At the outset, therefore, Each one of us must ruin many souls which could be saved by knowledge of a few elementary principles. Ernest was very much impressed. As for men curing themselves, continued Prior, they can no more cure their own souls than they can cure their own bodies, or manage their own law affairs. In these two last cases they see the folly of meddling with their own cases clearly enough, and go to a professional adviser as a matter of course. Surely a man's soul is at once a more difficult and intricate matter to treat, and at the same time it is more important to him that it should be treated rightly than that either his body or his money should be so. What are we to think of the practice of a church which encourages people to rely on unprofessional advice in matters affecting their eternal welfare, when they would not think of jeopardizing their worldly affairs by such insane conduct? Ernest could see no weak place in this. These ideas had crossed his own mind vaguely before now, but he had never laid hold of them or set them in an orderly manner before himself. Nor was he quick at detecting false analogies and the misuse of metaphors. In fact, he was a mere child in the hands of his fellow curate. And what, resumed Prior, does all this point to? Firstly, to the duty of confession, the outcry against which is absurd as an outcry would be against dissection as part of the training of medical students. Granted, these young men must see and do a great deal we do not ourselves like even to think of, but they should adopt some other profession unless they are prepared for this. They may even get inoculated with poison from a dead body and lose their lives, but they must stand their chance. So if we aspire to be priests in deed as well as name, we must familiarize ourselves with the minutest and most repulsive details of all kinds of sin, so that we may recognize it in all its stages. Some of us must doubtlessly perish spiritually in such investigations. We cannot help it, all science must have its martyrs, and none of these will deserve better of humanity than those who have fallen in the pursuit of spiritual pathology. Ernest grew more and more interested, but in the meekness of his soul said nothing. I do not desire this martyrdom for myself, continued the other, on the contrary I will avoid it to the very utmost of my power, but if it be God's will that I should fall while studying what I believe most calculated to advance His glory, then, I say, not my will, O Lord, but thine be done. This was too much even for Ernest. I heard of an Irish woman once, he said, with a smile, who said she was a martyr to the drink. And so she was, rejoined Prior with warmth, and he went on to show that this good woman was an experimentalist whose experiment, though disastrous in its effects upon herself, was pregnant with instruction to other people. She was thus a true martyr or witness to the frightful consequences of intemperance, to the saving, doubtless, of many who but for her martyrdom would have taken to drinking. She was one of a forlorn hope whose failure to take a certain position went to the proving it to be impregnable and therefore to the abandonment of all attempt to take it. This was almost as great a gain to mankind as the actual taking of the position would have been. Besides, he added more hurriedly, the limits of vice and virtue are wretchedly ill-defined. Half the vices which the world condemns most loudly have seeds of good in them and require moderate use rather than total abstinence. Ernest asked timidly for an instance. No, no, said Prior, I will give you no instance, but I will give you a formula that shall embrace all instances. It is this, that no practice is entirely vicious which has not been extinguished among the comeliest, most vigorous, and most cultivated races of mankind in spite of centuries of endeavor to extirpate it. If a vice in spite of such efforts can still hold its own among the most polished nations, it must be founded on some immutable truth or fact in human nature, and must have some compensatory advantage which we cannot afford altogether to dispense with. But, said Ernest timidly, is not this virtually doing away with all distinction between right and wrong, and leaving people without any moral guide whatever? Not the people, was the answer. It must be our care to be guides to these, for they are and always will be incapable of guiding themselves sufficiently. We should tell them what they must do, and in an ideal state of things should be able to enforce their doing it. Perhaps when we are better instructed the ideal state may come about. Nothing will so advance it as greater knowledge of spiritual pathology on our own part. For this, Three things are necessary: firstly, absolute freedom in experiment for us the clergy; secondly, absolute knowledge of what the laity think and do, and of what thoughts and actions result in what spiritual conditions; and thirdly, a compacter organization among ourselves. If we are to do any good, we must be a closely united body, and must be sharply divided from the laity. Also, we must be free from those ties which a wife and children involve. I can hardly express the horror with which I am filled by seeing English priests living in what I can only designate as open matrimony. It is deplorable. The priest must be absolutely sexless, if not in practice, yet at any rate in theory, absolutely, and that too, by a theory so universally accepted that none shall venture to dispute it. But, said Ernest, has not the Bible already told people what they ought and ought not to do, and is it not enough for us to insist on what can be found here, and let the rest alone? If you begin with the Bible, was the rejoinder, you are 3 parts gone on the road to infidelity, and will go the other part before you know where you are. The Bible is not without its value to us the clergy, but for the laity it is a stumbling block which cannot be taken out of their way too soon or too completely. Of course, I mean on the supposition that they read it, which, happily, they seldom do. If people read the Bible as the ordinary British churchman or churchwoman reads it, it is harmless enough, but if they read it with any care, which we should assume they will if we give it them at all, it is fatal to them. What do you mean? Said Ernest, more and more astonished, but more and more feeling that he was at least in the hands of a man who had definite ideas. Your question shows me that you have never read your Bible. A more unreliable book was never put upon paper. Take my advice and don't read it, not till you are a few years older, and may do so safely. But surely you believe the Bible when it tells you of such things as that Christ died and rose from the dead? Surely you believe this? Said Ernest, quite prepared to be told that Prior believed nothing of the kind. I do not believe it, I know it. But how, if the testimony of the Bible fails? On that of the living voice of the Church, which I know to be infallible and to be informed of Christ himself. Chapter 53. The foregoing conversation and others like it made a deep impression upon my hero. If next day he had taken a walk with Mr. Hawke, and heard what he had to say on the other side, he would have been just as much struck, and as ready to fling off what Prior had told him, as he now was to throw aside all he had ever heard from anyone except Prior. But there was no Mr. Hawke at hand, so Prior had everything his own way. Embryo minds, like embryo bodies, pass through a number of strange metamorphoses before they adopt their final shape. It is no more to be wondered at that one who is going to turn out a Roman Catholic, should have passed through the stages of being first a Methodist, and then a freethinker, than that a man should at some former time have been a mere cell, and later on an invertebrate animal. Ernest, however, could not be expected to know this. Embryos never do. Embryos think with each stage of their development that they have now reached the only condition which really suits them. This, they say, must certainly be their last, inasmuch as its close will be so great a shock that nothing can survive it. Every change is a shock, every shock is a portendo death. What we call death is only a shock great enough to destroy our power to recognize a past and a present as resembling one another. It is the making us consider the points of difference between our present and our past greater than the points of resemblance, so that we can no longer call the former of these two in any proper sense a continuation of the second, but find it less trouble to think of it as something that we choose to call new. But, to let this pass, it was clear that spiritual pathology, I confess that I do not know myself what spiritual pathology means, but Prior and Ernest doubtless did, was the great desideratum of the age. It seemed to Ernest that he had made this discovery himself and been familiar with it all his life, that he had never known, in fact, of anything else. He wrote long letters to his college friends expounding his views as though he had been one of the Apostolic Fathers. As for the Old Testament writers, he had no patience with them. Do oblige me, I find him writing to one friend, by reading the prophet Zechariah, and giving me your candid opinion upon him. He is poor stuff, full of Yankee bounds. It is sickening to live in an age when such balderdash can be gravely admired, whether as poetry or a prophecy. This was because Prior had set him against Zechariah. I do not know what Zechariah had done. I should think myself that Zechariah was a very good prophet. Perhaps it was because he was a Bible writer, and not a very prominent one, that Prior selected him as one through whom to disparage the Bible in comparison with the Church. To his friend Dawson I find him saying a little later on, "Prior and I continue our walks, working out each other's thoughts. At first he used to do all the thinking, but I think I am pretty well abreast of him now, and rather chuckle at seeing that he is already beginning to modify some of the views he held most strongly when I first knew him. Then I think he was on the high road to Rome. Now, however, he seems to be a good deal struck with a suggestion of mine in which you, too, perhaps may be interested. You see, we must infuse new life into the Church somehow. We are not holding our own against either Rome or infidelity. I may say in passing that I do not believe Ernest had as yet ever seen an infidel, not to speak to. I proposed, therefore, a few days back to Prior, and he fell in eagerly with the proposal as soon as he saw that I had the means of carrying it out, that we should set on foot a spiritual movement somewhat analogous to the Young England movement of 20 years ago, the aim of which shall be at once to outbid Rome on the one hand, and skepticism on the other. For this purpose I see nothing better than the foundation of an institution or college for placing the nature and treatment of sin on a more scientific basis than it rests at present. We want, to borrow a useful term of Prior's, a college of spiritual pathology where young men, I suppose Ernest thought he was no longer young by this time, may study the nature and treatment of the sins of the soul as medical students study those of the bodies of their patients. Such a college, as you will probably admit, will approach both Rome on the one hand, and science on the other, Rome, as giving the priesthood more skill, and therefore as paving the way for their obtaining greater power, and science, by recognizing that even free thought has a certain kind of value in spiritual inquiries. To this purpose Prior and I have resolved to devote ourselves henceforth heart and soul. Of course, my ideas are still unshaped, and all will depend upon the men by whom the college is first worked. I am not yet a priest, but Prior is, and if I were to start the college, Prior might take charge of it for a time and I work under him nominally as his subordinate. Prior himself suggested this. Is it not generous of him? The worst of it is that we have not enough money. I have, it is true, £5,000, but we want at least £10,000, so Prior says, before we can start. When we are fairly underway I might live at the college and draw a salary from the foundation, so that it is all one, or nearly so, whether I invest my money in this way or in buying a living. Besides I want very little. It is certain that I shall never marry. No clergyman should think of this, and an unmarried man can live on next to nothing. Still I do not see my way to as much money as I want, and Prior suggests that as we can hardly earn more now we must get it by a judicious series of investments. Prior knows several people who make quite a handsome income out of very little or, indeed, I may say, nothing at all, by buying things at a place they call the Stock Exchange. I don't know much about it yet, but Prior says I should soon learn. He thinks, indeed, that I have shown rather a talent in this direction, and under proper auspices should make a very good man of business. Others, of course, and not I, must decide this, but a man can do anything if he gives his mind to it, and though I should not care about having more money for my own sake, I care about it very much when I think of the good I could do with it by saving souls from such horrible torture hereafter. Why, if the thing succeeds, and I really cannot see what is to hinder it, it is hardly possible to exaggerate its importance, nor the proportions which it may ultimately assume, etc., etc. Again I asked Ernest whether he minded my printing this. He winced, but said no, not if it helps you to tell your story, but don't you think it is too long? I said it would let the reader see for himself how things were going in half the time that it would take me to explain them to him. Very well then, Keep it by all means. I continue turning over my file of Ernest's letters and find as follows: "Thanks for your last," in answer to which I send you a rough copy of a letter I sent to the Times a day or two back. They did not insert it, but it embodies pretty fully my ideas on the parochial visitation question, and Prior fully approves of the letter. Think it carefully over and send it back to me when read, for it is so exactly my present creed that I cannot afford to lose it. I should very much like to have a viva voce discussion on these matters. I can only see for certain that we have suffered a dreadful loss in being no longer able to excommunicate. We should excommunicate rich and poor alike, and pretty freely too. If this power were restored to us, we could, I think, soon put a stop to by far the greater part of the sin and misery with which we are surrounded. These letters were written only a few weeks after Ernest had been ordained, but they are nothing to others that he wrote a little later on. In his eagerness to regenerate the Church of England, and through this the universe, by the means which Prior had suggested to him, it occurred to him to try to familiarize himself with the habits and thoughts of the poor by going and living among them. I think he got this notion from Kingsley's Alton Locke, which, high churchman though he for the nonce was, he had devoured as he had devoured Stanley's Life of Arnold, Dickens's novels, and whatever other literary garbage of the day was most likely to do him harm. At any rate, he actually put his scheme into practice, and took lodgings in Ashpit Place, a small street in the neighbourhood of Drury Lane Theatre, in a house of which the landlady was the widow of a cabman. This lady occupied the whole ground floor. In the front kitchen there was a tinker. The back kitchen was let to a bellows mender. On the first floor came Ernest, with his 2 rooms which he furnished comfortably, for one must draw the line somewhere. The 2 upper floors were parcelled out among 4 different sets of lodgers. There was a tailor named Holt, a drunken fellow who used to beat his wife at night till her screams woke the house. Above him there was another tailor with a wife but no children. These people were Wesleyans, given to drink but not noisy. The 2 back rooms were held by single ladies, who it seemed to Ernest must be respectably connected, for well-dressed gentlemanly-looking young men used to go up and down stairs past Ernest's rooms to call at any rate on Miss Snow. Ernest had heard her door slam after they had passed. He thought, too, that some of them went up to Miss Maitland's. Mrs. J, the landlady, told Ernest that these were brothers and cousins of Miss Snow's, and that she was herself looking out for a situation as a governess, but at present had an engagement as an actress at the Drury Lane Theatre. Ernest asked whether Miss Maitland in the top back was also looking out for a situation, and was told she was wanting an engagement as a milliner. He believed whatever Mrs. J told him. Chapter 54. This move on Ernest's part was variously commented upon by his friends, the general opinion being that it was just like Pontifex, who was sure to do something unusual wherever he went, but that on the whole the idea was commendable. Christina could not restrain herself when on sounding her clerical neighbors she found them inclined to applaud her son for conduct which they idealized into something much more self-denying than it really was. She did not quite like his living in such an unaristocratic neighborhood, but what he was doing would probably get into the newspapers, and then great people would take notice of him. Besides, it would be very cheap. Down among these poor people he could live for next to nothing, and might put by a great deal of his income. As for temptations, there could be few or none in such a place as that. This argument about cheapness was the one with which she most successfully met Theobald, who grumbled more so that he had no sympathy with his son's extravagance and conceit. When Christina pointed out to him that it would be cheap, he replied that there was something in that. On Ernest himself the effect was to confirm the good opinion of himself which had been growing upon him ever since he had begun to read for orders, and to make him flatter himself that he was among the few who were ready to give up all for Christ. Ere long he began to conceive of himself as a man with a mission and a great future. His lightest and most hastily formed opinions began to be of momentous importance to him, and he inflicted them, as I have already shown, on his old friends, week by week becoming more and more intent with himself and his own crotchets. I should like well enough to draw a veil over this part of my hero's career, but cannot do so without mooring my story. In the spring of 1859 I find him writing, "I cannot call the visible church Christian till its fruits are Christian, that is until the fruits of the members of the Church of England are in conformity, or something like conformity, with her teaching. I cordially agree with the teaching of the Church of England in most respects, but she says one thing and does another, and until excommunication, yes, and wholesale excommunication, be resorted to, I cannot call her a Christian institution. I should begin with our rector, and if I found it necessary to follow him up by excommunicating the bishop, I should not flinch even from this. The present London rectors are hopeless people to deal with. My own is one of the best of them, but the moment prior and I show signs of wanting to attack an evil in a way not recognized by routine, or of remedying anything about which no outcry has been made, we are met with, "I cannot think what you mean by all this disturbance, nobody else among the clergy sees these things, and I have no wish to be the first to begin turning everything topsy-turvy." And then people call him a sensible man. I have no patience with them. However, we know what we want, and, as I wrote to Dawson the other day, have a scheme on foot which will, I think, fairly meet the requirements of the case. But we want more money, and my first move towards getting this has not turned out quite so satisfactorily as Pryor and I had hoped. We shall, however, I doubt not, retrieve it shortly. When Ernest came to London he intended doing a good deal of house-to-house visiting, but Pryor had talked him out of this even before he settled down in his new and strangely chosen apartments. The line he now took was that if people wanted Christ, they must prove their want by taking some little trouble, and the trouble required of them was that they should come and seek him. Ernest, out there he was in the midst of them ready to teach. If people did not choose to come to him it was no fault of his. "My great business here," he writes again to Dawson, "is to observe. I am not doing much in parish work beyond my share of the daily services. I have a man's Bible class, and a boy's Bible class, and a good many young men and boys to whom I give instruction one way or another. Then there are the Sunday school children, with whom I fill my room on a Sunday evening as full as it will hold, and let them sing hymns and chants. They like this. I do a great deal of reading, chiefly of books which Pryor and I think most likely to help. We find nothing comparable to the Jesuits. Pryor is a thorough gentleman, and an admirable man of business, no less observant of the things of this world, in fact, than of the things above. By a brilliant coup he has retrieved, or nearly so, a rather serious loss which threatened to delay indefinitely the execution of our great scheme. He and I daily gather fresh principles. I believe great things are before me, and am strong in the hope of being able by and by to effect much. As for you I bid you Godspeed. Be bold but logical, speculative but cautious, daringly courageous, but properly circumspect with all, etc., etc. I think this may do for the present. Chapter 55. I had called on Ernest as a matter of course when he first came to London, but had not seen him. I had been out when he returned my call, so that he had been in town for some weeks before I actually saw him, which I did not very long after he had taken possession of his new rooms. I liked his face, but except for the common bond of music, in respect of which our tastes were singularly alike, I should hardly have known how to get on with him. To do him justice, he did not air any of his schemes to me until I had drawn him out concerning them. I, to borrow the words of Ernest's landlady, Mrs. J, am not a very regular churchgoer. I discovered upon cross-examination that Mrs. J had been to church once when she was churched for her son Tom some 25 years since, but never either before or afterwards, not even, I fear, to be married, for though she called herself Mrs. she wore no wedding ring, and spoke of the person who should have been Mr. J as my poor dear boy's father, not as my husband. But to return. I was vexed at Ernest's having been ordained. I was not ordained myself and I did not like my friends to be ordained, nor did I like having to be on my best behavior and to look as if butter would not melt in my mouth, and all for a boy whom I remembered when he knew yesterday and tomorrow and Tuesday, but not a day of the week more, not even Sunday itself, and when he said he did not like the kitten because it had pins in its toes. I looked at him and thought of his Aunt Alethea, and how fast the money she had left him was accumulating, and it was all to go to this young man, who would use it probably in the very last ways with which Miss Pontifex would have sympathized. I was annoyed. She always said, I thought to myself, that she should make a mess of it, but I did not think she would have made as great a mess of it as this. Then I thought that perhaps if his aunt had lived he would not have been like this. Ernest behaved quite nicely to me, and I own that the fault was mine if the conversation drew towards dangerous subjects. I was the aggressor, presuming I suppose upon my age and long acquaintance with him, as giving me a right to make myself unpleasant in a quiet way. Then he came out, and the exasperating part of it was that up to a certain point he was so very right. Grant him his premises and his conclusions were sound enough, nor could I, seeing that he was already ordained, join issue with him about his premises as I should certainly have done if I had had a chance of doing so before he had taken orders. The result was that I had to beat a retreat and went away not in the best of humors. I believe the truth was that I liked Ernest, and was vexed at his being a clergyman, and at a clergyman having so much money coming to him. I talked a little with Mrs. John my way out. She and I had reckoned one another up at first sight as being neither of us very regular churchgoers, and the strings of her tongue had been loosened. She said Ernest would die. He was much too good for the world, and he looked so sad, just like young Watkins of the Crown over the way, who died a month ago, and his poor dear skin was white as alablaster, leastways they say he shot hisself. They took him from the Mortimer. I met them just as I was going with my Rose to get a pint of 4 ale, and she had her arm in splints. She told her sister she wanted to go to Perry's to get some wool, instead of which it was only a stroll to get me a pint of ale. Bless her heart, there's nobody else would do that much for poor old Ja, and it's a horrid lie to say she is gay, not but what I like a gay woman, I do. I'd rather give a gay woman half a crown than stand a modest woman a pot of beer, but I don't want to go associating with bad girls for all that. So they took him from the Mortimer, they wouldn't let him go home no more, and he done it that artful, you know. His wife was in the country living with her mother, and she always spoke respectful o' my Rose. Poor dear, I hope his soul is in heaven. Well, sir, would you believe it? There's that in Mr. Pontifex's face which is just like young Watkins. He looks that worrited and scrunched up at times, but it's never for the same reason, for he don't know nothing at all, no more than a unborn babe. No, he don't. Why, there's not a monkey going about London with an Italian organ grinder but knows more than Mr. Pontifex do. He don't know. Well, I suppose, here a child came in on an errand from some neighbor and interrupted her, or I can form no idea where or when she would have ended her discourse. I seized the opportunity to run away, but not before I had given her 5 shillings and made her write down my address, for I was a little frightened by what she said. I told her if she thought her lodger grew worse, she was to come and let me know. Weeks went by and I did not see her again. Having done as much as I had, I felt absolved from doing more, and let Ernest alone, as thinking that he and I should only bore one another. He had now been ordained a little over 4 months, but these months had not brought happiness or satisfaction with them. He had lived in a clergyman's house all his life, and might have been expected perhaps to have known pretty much what being a clergyman was like, and so he did. A country clergyman, he had formed an ideal, however, as regards what a town clergyman could do, and was trying in a feeble tentative way to realize it, but somehow or other it always managed to escape him. He lived among the poor, but he did not find that he got to know them. The idea that they would come to him proved to be a mistaken one. He did indeed visit a few tame pets whom his rector desired him to look after. There was an old man and his wife who lived next door but one to Ernest himself. Then there was a plumber of the name of Chesterfield, an aged lady of the name of Gover, blind and bedridden, who munched and munched her feeble old toothless jaws as Ernest spoke or read to her, but who could do little more, A Mr. Brooks, a rag and bottle merchant in Birdsea's Rants in the last stage of dropsy, and perhaps half a dozen or so others. What did it all come to, when he did go to see them? The plumber wanted to be flattered, and liked fooling a gentleman into wasting his time by scratching his ears for him. Mrs. Gover, poor old woman, wanted money. She was very good and meek, and when Ernest got her a shilling from Lady Anne Jones's bequest, she said it was small but seasonable, and munched in gratitude. Ernest sometimes gave her a little money himself, but not, as he says now, half what he ought to have given. What could he do else that would have been of the smallest use to her? Nothing indeed, but giving occasional half-crowns to Mrs. Gover was not regenerating the universe, and Ernest wanted nothing short of this. The world was all out of joint, and instead of feeling it to be a cursed spite that he was born to set it right, he thought he was just the kind of person that was wanted for the job, and was eager to set to work, only he did not exactly know how to begin. For the beginning he had made with Mr. Chesterfield and Mrs. Gover did not promise great developments. Then poor Mr. Brooks, he suffered very much, terribly indeed. He was not in want of money, he wanted to die and couldn't, just as we sometimes want to go to sleep and cannot. He had been a serious-minded man, and death frightened him as it must frighten anyone who believes that all his most secret thoughts will be shortly exposed in public. When I read Ernest the description of how his father used to visit Mrs. Thompson at Battersby, he colored and said, "That's just what I used to say to Mr. Brooks." Ernest felt that his visits, so far from comforting Mr. Brooks, made him fear death more and more, but how could he help it? Even Prior, who had been curate a couple of years, did not know personally more than a couple of hundred people in the parish at the outside, and it was only at the houses of very few of these that he ever visited. But then Prior had such a strong objection on principle to house visitations. What a drop in the sea were those with whom he and Prior were brought into direct communication in comparison with those whom he must reach and move if he were to produce much effect of any kind, one way or the other. Why, there were between 15 and 20,000 poor in the parish, of whom but the merest fraction ever attended a place of worship. Some few went to dissenting chapels, a few were Roman Catholics, by far the greater number, however, were practically infidels, if not actively hostile, at any rate indifferent to religion, while many were avowed atheists, admirers of Tom Paine, of whom he now heard for the first time, but he never met and conversed with any of these. Was he really doing everything that could be expected of him? It was all very well to say that he was doing as much as other young clergymen did. That was not the kind of answer which Jesus Christ was likely to accept. Why, the Pharisees themselves in all probability did as much as the other Pharisees did. What he should do was to go into the highways and byways, and compel people to come in. Was he doing this? Or were not they rather compelling him to keep outside their doors at any rate? He began to have an uneasy feeling as though ere long, unless he kept a sharp lookout, he should drift into being a sham. True, all would be changed as soon as he could endow the College for Spiritual Pathology. Matters, however, had not gone too well with the things that people bought in the place that was called the Stock Exchange. In order to get on faster, it had been arranged that Ernest should buy more of these things than he could pay for, with the idea that in a few weeks, or even days, they would be much higher in value, and he could sell them at a tremendous profit. But, unfortunately, instead of getting higher, they had fallen immediately after Ernest had bought, and obstinately refused to get up again. So, after a few settlements, he had got frightened, for he read an article in some newspaper, which said they would go ever so much lower, and, contrary to Prior's advice, he insisted on selling at a loss of something like £500. He had hardly sold when up went the shares again, and he saw how foolish he had been, and how wise Prior was, for if Prior's advice had been followed, he would have made £500, instead of losing it. However, he told himself he must live and learn. Then Prior made a mistake. They had bought some shares, and the shares went up delightfully for about a fortnight. This was a happy time indeed, for by the end of a fortnight, the lost £500 had been recovered, and £300 or £400 had been cleared into the bargain. All the feverish anxiety of that miserable 6 weeks, when the £500 was being lost, was now being repaid with interest. Ernest wanted to sell and make sure of the profit, but Prior would not hear of it. They would go ever so much higher yet, and he showed Ernest an article in some newspaper which proved that what he said was reasonable, and they did go up a little, but only a very little, for then they went down, and Ernest saw first his clear profit of £300 or £400 go, and then the £500 loss, which he thought he had recovered, slipped away by falls of a half and one at a time, and then he lost £200 more. Then a newspaper said that these shares were the greatest rubbish that had ever been imposed upon the English public, and Ernest could stand it no longer, so he sold out, again this time against Prior's advice, so that when they went up, as they shortly did, Prior scored off Ernest a second time. Ernest was not used to vicissitudes of this kind, and they made him so anxious that his health was affected. It was arranged therefore that he had better know nothing of what was being done. Prior was a much better man of business than he was, and would see to it all. This relieved Ernest of a good deal of trouble, and was better after all for the investments themselves, for, as Prior justly said, a man must not have a faint heart if he hopes to succeed in buying and selling upon the stock exchange, and seeing Ernest nervous made Prior nervous too, at least, he said it did. So the money drifted more and more into Prior's hands. As for Prior himself, he had nothing but his curacy and a small allowance from his father. Some of Ernest's old friends got an inkling from his letters of what he was doing, and did their utmost to dissuade him, but he was as infatuated as a young lover of 22. Finding that these friends disapproved, he dropped away from them, and they, being bored with his egotism and high-flown ideas, were not sorry to let him do so. Of course, he said nothing about his speculations. Indeed, he hardly knew that anything done in so good a cause could be called speculation. At Battersby, when his father urged him to look out for a next presentation, and even brought 1 or 2 promising ones under his notice, he made objections and excuses, though always promising to do as his father desired very shortly. Chapter 56. By and by a subtle, indefinable malaise began to take possession of him. I once saw a very young foal trying to eat some most objectionable refuse, and unable to make up its mind whether it was good or no. Clearly it wanted to be told. If its mother had seen what it was doing she would have set it right in a moment, and as soon as ever it had been told that what it was eating was filth, the foal would have recognized it and never have wanted to be told again, but the foal could not settle the matter for itself, or make up its mind whether it liked what it was trying to eat or no, without assistance from without. I suppose it would have come to do so by and by, but it was wasting time and trouble, which a single look from its mother would have saved, just as wort will in time ferment of itself, but will ferment much more quickly if a little yeast be added to it. In the matter of knowing what gives us pleasure we are all like wort, and if unaided from without can only ferment slowly and toilsomely. My unhappy hero about this time was very much like the foal, or rather he felt much what the foal would have felt if its mother and all the other grown-up horses in the field had vowed that what it was eating was the most excellent and nutritious food to be found anywhere. He was so anxious to do what was right, and so ready to believe that everyone knew better than himself, that he never ventured to admit to himself that he might be all the while on a hopelessly wrong tack. It did not occur to him that there might be a blunder anywhere, much less did it occur to him to try and find out where the blunder was. Nevertheless he became daily more full of malaise, and daily, only he knew it not, more ripe for an explosion should a spark fall upon him. One thing, however, did begin to loom out of the general vagueness, and to this he instinctively turned as trying to seize it, I mean, the fact that he was saving very few souls, whereas there were thousands and thousands being lost hourly all around him which a little energy such as Mr. Hawks might save. Day after day went by, and what was he doing? Standing on professional etiquette, and praying that his shares might go up and down as he wanted them, so that they might give him money enough to enable him to regenerate the universe. But in the meantime the people were dying. How many souls would not be doomed to endless ages of the most frightful torments that the mind could think of, before he could bring his spiritual pathology engine to bear upon them? Why might he not stand and preach as he saw the dissenters doing sometimes in Lincoln's Inn Fields and other thoroughfares? He could say all that Mr. Hawke had said. Mr. Hawke was a very poor creature in Ernest's eyes now, for he was a low churchman, but we should not be above learning from anyone, and surely he could affect his hearers as powerfully as Mr. Hawke had affected him if he only had the courage to set to work. The people whom he saw preaching in the squares sometimes drew large audiences. He could at any rate preach better than they. Ernest broached this to Prior, who treated it as something too outrageous to be even thought of. Nothing, he said, could more tend to lower the dignity of the clergy and bring the church into contempt. His manner was brusque, and even rude. Ernest ventured a little mild dissent. He admitted it was not usual, but something at any rate must be done, and that quickly. This was how Wesley and Whitefield had begun that great movement which had kindled religious life in the minds of hundreds of thousands. This was no time to be standing on dignity. It was just because Wesley and Whitefield had done what the church would not that they had won men to follow them whom the church had now lost. Prior eyed Ernest searchingly, and after a pause said, "I don't know what to make of you, Pontifex. You are at once so very right and so very wrong. I agree with you heartily that something should be done, but it must not be done in a way which experience has shown leads to nothing but fanaticism and dissent. Do you approve of these Wesleyans? Do you hold your ordination vows so cheaply as to think that it does not matter whether the services of the Church are performed in her churches and with all due ceremony or not? If you do, then, frankly, you had no business to be ordained. If you do not, then remember that one of the first duties of a young deacon is obedience to authority. Neither the Catholic Church, nor yet the Church of England allows her clergy to preach in the streets of cities where there is no lack of churches." Ernest felt the force of this, and Prior saw that he wavered. "We are living," he continued more genially, "in an age of transition, and in a country which, though it has gained much by the Reformation, does not perceive how much it has also lost. You cannot and must not hawk Christ about in the streets as though you were in a heathen country whose inhabitants had never heard of him. The people here in London have had ample warning. Every church they pass is a protest to them against their lives, and a call to them to repent. Every church bell they hear is a witness against them. Every one of those whom they meet on Sundays going to or coming from church is a warning voice from God. If these countless influences produce no effect upon them, neither will the few transient words which they would hear from you. You are like Dives, and think that if one rose from the dead they would hear him. Perhaps they might, but then you cannot pretend that you have risen from the dead." Though the last few words were spoken laughingly, there was a sub-sneer about them which made Ernest wince, but he was quite subdued, and so the conversation ended. It left Ernest, however, not for the first time, consciously dissatisfied with Prior, and inclined to set his friend's opinion on one side, not openly, but quietly, and without telling Prior anything about it. Chapter 57. He had hardly parted from Prior before there occurred another incident which strengthened his discontent. He had fallen, as I have shown, among a gang of spiritual thieves or coiners, who passed the basest metal upon him without his finding it out, so childish and inexperienced was he in the ways of anything but those back eddies of the world, schools and universities. Among the bad threepenny pieces which had been passed off upon him, and which he kept for small hourly disbursement, was a remark that poor people were much nicer than the richer and better educated. Ernest now said that he always traveled third class not because it was cheaper, but because the people whom he met in third-class carriages were so much pleasanter and better behaved. As for the young men who attended Ernest's evening classes, they were pronounced to be more intelligent and better ordered generally than the average run of Oxford and Cambridge men. Our foolish young friend, having heard Prior talk to this effect, caught up all he said and reproduced it morse. One evening, however, About this time, whom should he see coming along a small street not far from his own but, of all persons in the world, Towneley, looking as full of life and good spirits as ever, and if possible even handsomer than he had been at Cambridge. Much as Ernest liked him, he found himself shrinking from speaking to him, and was endeavoring to pass him without doing so when Towneley saw him and stopped him at once, being pleased to see an old Cambridge face. He seemed for the moment a little confused at being seen in such a neighborhood, but recovered himself so soon that Ernest hardly noticed it, and then plunged into a few kindly remarks about old times. Ernest felt that he quailed as he saw Towneley's eye wander to his white necktie and saw that he was being reckoned up, and rather disapprovingly reckoned up, as a parson. It was the merest passing shade upon Towneley's face, but Ernest had felt it. Towneley said a few words of common form to Ernest about his profession as being what he thought would be most likely to interest him, and Ernest, still confused and shy, gave him for lack of something better to say his little threepenny bit about poor people being so very nice. Towneley took this for what it was worth and nodded assent, whereon Ernest imprudently went further and said, "Don't you like poor people very much yourself?" Towneley gave his face a comical but good-natured screw, and said quietly, but slowly and decidedly, "No, no, no," and escaped. It was all over with Ernest from that moment. As usual, he did not know it, but he had entered nonetheless upon another reaction. Towneley had just taken Ernest's threepenny bit into his hands, looked at it and returned it to him as a bad one. Why did he see in a moment that it was a bad one now, though he had been unable to see it when he had taken it from Prior? Of course some poor people were very nice, and always would be so, but as those scales had fallen suddenly from his eyes he saw that no one was nicer for being poor, and that between the upper and lower classes there was a gulf which amounted practically to an impassable barrier. That evening he reflected a good deal. If Towneley was right, and Ernest felt that the no had applied not to the remark about poor people only, but to the whole scheme and scope of his own recently adopted ideas, he and Prior must surely be on a wrong track. Towneley had not argued with him, he had said one word only, and that one of the shortest in the language, but Ernest was in a fit state for inoculation, and the minute particle of virus set about working immediately. Which did he now think was most likely to have taken the juster view of life and things, and whom would it be best to imitate, Towneley or Prior? His heart returned answer to itself without a moment's hesitation. The faces of men like Towneley were open and kindly, they looked as if at ease themselves, and as though they would set all who had to do with them at ease as far as might be. The faces of Prior and his friends were not like this. Why had he felt tacitly rebuked as soon as he had met Towneley? Was he not a Christian? Certainly, he believed in the Church of England as a matter of course. Then how could he be himself wrong in trying to act up to the faith that he and Towneley held in common? He was trying to lead a quiet, unobtrusive life of self-devotion, whereas Towneley was not, so far as he could see, trying to do anything of the kind. He was only trying to get on comfortably in the world, and to look and be as nice as possible. And he was nice, and Ernest knew that such men as himself and Prior were not nice, and his old dejection came over him. Then came an even worse reflection, how if he had fallen among material thieves as well as spiritual ones? He knew very little of how his money was going on, he had put it all now into Prior's hands, and though Prior gave him cash to spend whenever he wanted it, he seemed impatient of being questioned as to what was being done with the principal. It was part of the understanding, he said, that was to be left to him, and Ernest had better stick to this, or he, Prior, would throw up the College of Spiritual Pathology altogether, and so Ernest was cowed into acquiescence, or cajoled, according to the humor in which Prior saw him to be. Ernest thought that further questions would look as if he doubted Prior's word, and also that he had gone too far to be able to recede in decency or honor. This, however, he felt was riding out to meet trouble unnecessarily. Prior had been a little impatient, but he was a gentleman and an admirable man of business, so his money would doubtless come back to him all right some day. Ernest comforted himself as regards this last source of anxiety, but as regards the other, he began to feel as though, if he was to be saved, a good Samaritan must hurry up from somewhere, he knew not whence. Chapter 58. Next day he felt stronger again. He had been listening to the voice of the evil one on the night before, and would parley no more with such thoughts. He had chosen his profession, and his duty was to persevere with it. If he was unhappy, it was probably because he was not giving up all for Christ. Let him see whether he could not do more than he was doing now, and then perhaps a light would be shed upon his path. It was all very well to have made the discovery that he didn't very much like poor people, but he had got to put up with them, for it was among them that his work must lie. Such men as Townley were very kind and considerate, but he knew well enough it was only on condition that he did not preach to them. He could manage the poor better, and, let Prior sneer as he liked, he was resolved to go more among them, and try the effect of bringing Christ to them if they would not come and seek Christ of themselves. He would begin with his own house. Who then should he take first? Surely he could not do better than begin with the tailor who lived immediately over his head. This would be desirable, not only because he was the one who seemed to stand most in need of conversion, but also because, if he were once converted, he would no longer beat his wife at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the house would be much pleasanter in consequence. He would therefore go upstairs at once, and have a quiet talk with this man. Before doing so, he thought it would be well if he were to draw up something like a plan of a campaign. He therefore reflected over some pretty conversations which would do very nicely if Mr. Holt would be kind enough to make the answers proposed for him in their proper places. But the man was a great hulking fellow, of a savage temper, and Ernest was forced to admit that unforeseen developments might arise to disconcert him. They say it takes 9 tailors to make a man, but Ernest felt that it would take at least 9 Ernests to make a Mr. Holt. How if, as soon as Ernest came in, the tailor were to become violent and abusive? What could he do? Mr. Holt was in his own lodgings, and had a right to be undisturbed. A legal right, yes, but had he a moral right? Ernest thought not, considering his mode of life. But put this on one side, if the man were to be violent, what should he do? Paul had fought with wild beasts at Ephesus. That must indeed have been awful, but perhaps they were not very wild beasts. A rabbit and a canary are wild beasts, but, formidable or not as wild beasts go, they would, nevertheless, stand no chance against St. Paul, for he was inspired. The miracle would have been if the wild beasts escaped, not that St. Paul should have done so, but, however all this might be, Ernest felt that he dared not begin to convert Mr. Holt by fighting him. Why, when he had heard Mrs. Holt screaming murder, he had cowered under the bedclothes and waited, expecting to hear the blood dripping through the ceiling onto his own floor. His imagination translated every sound into a pat, 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 and once or twice he thought he had felt it dropping onto his counterpane, but he had never gone upstairs to try and rescue poor Mrs. Holt. Happily it had proved next morning that Mrs. Holt was in her usual health. Ernest was in despair about hitting on any good way of opening up spiritual communication with his neighbor, when it occurred to him that he had better perhaps begin by going upstairs, and knocking very gently at Mr. Holt's door. He would then resign himself to the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and act as the occasion, which, I suppose, was another name for the Holy Spirit, suggested. Triply armed with this reflection, he mounted the stairs quite jauntily, and was about to knock when he heard Holt's voice inside swearing savagely at his wife. This made him pause to think whether after all the moment was an auspicious one, and while he was thus pausing, Mr. Holt, who had heard that someone was on the stairs, opened the door and put his head out. When he saw Ernest, he made an unpleasant, not to say offensive movement, which might or might not have been directed at Ernest, and looked altogether so ugly that my hero had an instantaneous and unequivocal revelation from the Holy Spirit to the effect that he should continue his journey upstairs at once, as though he had never intended arresting it at Mr. Holt's room, and begin by converting Mr. and Mrs. Baxter, the Methodists in the top floor front. So this was what he did. These good people received him with open arms, and were quite ready to talk. He was beginning to convert them from Methodism to the Church of England, when all at once he found himself embarrassed by discovering that he did not know what he was to convert them from. He knew the Church of England, or thought he did, but he knew nothing of Methodism beyond its name. When he found that, according to Mr. Baxter, the Wesleyans had a vigorous system of church discipline, which worked admirably in practice, it appeared to him that John Wesley had anticipated the spiritual engine which he and Pryor were preparing, and when he left the room he was aware that he had caught more of a spiritual tartar than he had expected. But he must certainly explain to Pryor that the Wesleyans had a system of church discipline. This was very important. Mr. Baxter advised Ernest on no account to meddle with Mr. Holt, and Ernest was much relieved at the advice. If an opportunity arose of touching the man's heart, he would take it. He would pat the children on the head when he saw them on the stairs, and ingratiate himself with them as far as he dared. They were sturdy youngsters, and Ernest was afraid even of them, for they were ready with their tongues, and knew much for their ages. Ernest felt that it would indeed be almost better for him that a millstone should be hanged about his neck, and he cast into the sea, than that he should offend one of the little Holts. However, he would try not to offend them, perhaps an occasional penny or two might square them. This was as much as he could do, for he saw that the attempt to be instant out of season, as well as in season, would, St. Paul's injunction notwithstanding, end in failure. Mrs. Baxter gave a very bad account of Miss Emily Snow, who lodged in the second floor back next to Mr. Holt. Her story was quite different from that of Mrs. Judd the landlady. She would doubtless be only too glad to receive Ernest's ministrations or those of any other gentleman, but she was no governess, she was in the ballet at Drury Lane, and besides this, she was a very bad young woman, and if Mrs. Baxter was landlady would not be allowed to stay in the house a single hour, not she indeed. Miss Maitland in the next room to Mrs. Baxter's own was a quiet and respectable young woman to all appearance. Mrs. Baxter had never known of any goings-on in that quarter, but, bless you, still waters run deep, and these girls were all alike, one as bad as the other. She was out at all kinds of hours, and when you knew that you knew all. Ernest did not pay much heed to these aspersions of Mrs. Baxter's. Mrs. Judd got round the greater number of his many blind sides, and had warned him not to believe Mrs. Baxter, whose lip she said was something awful. Ernest had heard that women were always jealous of one another, and certainly these young women were more attractive than Mrs. Baxter was, so jealousy was probably at the bottom of it. If they were maligned there could be no objection to his making their acquaintance, if not maligned they had all the more need of his ministrations. He would reclaim them at once. He told Mrs. Judd of his intention. Mrs. Judd first tried to dissuade him, but seeing him resolute, suggested that she should herself see Miss Snow first, so as to prepare her and prevent her from being alarmed by his visit. She was not at home now, but in the course of the next day, it should be arranged. In the meantime he had better try Mr. Shaw, the tinker, in the front kitchen. Mrs. Baxter had told Ernest that Mr. Shaw was from the North Country, and an avowed freethinker. He would probably, she said, rather like a visit, but she did not think Ernest would stand much chance of making a convert of him. Chapter 59. Before going down into the kitchen to convert the tinker, Ernest ran hurriedly over his analysis of Paley's evidences, and put into his pocket a copy of Archbishop Whately's Historic Doubts. Then he descended the dark rotten old stairs and knocked at the tinker's door. Mr. Shaw was very civil. He said he was rather throng just now, but if Ernest did not mind the sound of hammering he should be very glad of a talk with him. Our hero, assenting to this, ere long led the conversation to Whately's Historic Doubts, a work which, as the reader may know, pretends to show that there never was any such person as Napoleon Bonaparte, and thus satirizes the arguments of those who have attacked the Christian miracles. Mr. Shaw said he knew Historic Doubts very well. "And what you think of it?" said Ernest, who regarded the pamphlet as a masterpiece of wit and cogency. "If you really want to know," said Mr. Shaw, with a slight twinkle, I think that he who was so willing and able to prove that what was not, would be equally able and willing to make a case for thinking that what was not was, if it suited his purpose. Ernest was very much taken aback. How was it that all the clever people of Cambridge had never put him up to this simple rejoinder? The answer is easy: they did not develop it for the same reason that a hen had never developed webbed feet, that is to say, because they did not want to do so, but this was before the days of evolution, and Ernest could not as yet know anything of the great principle that underlies it. You see, continued Mr. Shaw, these writers all get their living by writing in a certain way, and the more they write in that way, the more they are likely to get on. You should not call them dishonest for this any more than a judge should call a barrister dishonest for earning his living by defending one in whose innocence he does not seriously believe, but you should hear the barrister on the other side before you decide upon the case. This was another facer. Ernest could only stammer that he had endeavored to examine these questions as carefully as he could. You think you have, said Mr. Shaw, you Oxford and Cambridge gentlemen think you have examined everything. I have examined very little myself except the bottoms of old kettles and saucepans, but if you will answer me a few questions, I will tell you whether or no you have examined much more than I have. Ernest expressed his readiness to be questioned. Then, said the tinker, give me the story of the resurrection of Jesus Christ as told in St. John's Gospel. I am sorry to say that Ernest mixed up the four accounts in a deplorable manner. He even made the angel come down and roll away the stone and sit upon it. He was covered with confusion when the tinker first told him without the book of some of his many inaccuracies, and then verified his criticisms by referring to the New Testament itself. Now, said Mr. Shaw good-naturedly, I am an old man and you are a young one, so perhaps you'll not mind my giving you a piece of advice. I like you, for I believe you mean well. But you've been real bad brought up, and I don't think you have ever had so much as a chance yet. You know nothing of our side of the question, and I have just shown you that you do not know much more of your own, but I think you will make a kind of Carlyle sort of a man some day. Now go upstairs and read the accounts of the resurrection correctly without mixing them up, and have a clear idea of what it is that each writer tells us. Then if you feel inclined to pay me another visit I shall be glad to see you, for I shall know you have made a good beginning and mean business. Till then, sir, I must wish you a very good morning. Ernest retreated abashed. An hour sufficed him to perform the task enjoined upon him by Mr. Shaw, and at the end of that hour the no, 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 which still sounded in his ears as he heard it from Townley, came ringing up more loudly still from the very pages of the Bible itself, and in respect of the most important of all the events which are recorded in it. Surely Ernest's first day's attempt at more promiscuous visiting, and at carrying out his principles more thoroughly, had not been unfruitful. But he must go and have a talk with Prior. He therefore got his lunch and went to Prior's lodgings. Prior not being at home, he lounged to the British Museum reading room, then recently opened, sent for the Vestiges of Creation, which he had never yet seen, and spent the rest of the afternoon in reading it. Ernest did not see Prior on the day of his conversation with Mr. Shaw, but he did so next morning and found him in a good temper, which of late he had rarely been. Sometimes, indeed, he had behaved to Ernest in a way which did not bode well for the harmony with which the College of Spiritual Pathology would work when it had once been founded. It almost seemed as though he were trying to get a complete moral ascendancy over him, so as to make him a creature of his own. He did not think it possible that he could go too far, and indeed, when I reflect upon my hero's folly and inexperience, there is much to be said in excuse for the conclusion which Prior came to. As a matter of fact, however, it was not so. Ernest's faith in Prior had been too great to be shaken down all in a moment, but it had been weakened lately more than once. Ernest had fought hard against allowing himself to see this, nevertheless any third person who knew the pair would have been able to see that the connection between the two might end at any moment, for when the time for one of Ernest's snipe-like changes of flight came, he was quick in making it. The time, however, was not yet come, and the intimacy between the two was apparently all that it had ever been. It was only that horrid money business, so said Ernest to himself, that caused any unpleasantness between them, and no doubt Prior was right, and he, Ernest, much too nervous. However, that might stand over for the present. In like manner, though he had received a shock by reason of his conversation with Mr. Shaw, and by looking at the vestiges, he was as yet too much stunned to realize the change which was coming over him. In each case the momentum of old habits carried him forward in the old direction. He therefore called on Prior, and spent an hour and more with him. He did not say that he had been visiting among his neighbors, this to Prior would have been like a red rag to a bull. He only talked in much his usual vein about the proposed college, the lamentable want of interest in spiritual things which was characteristic of modern society, and other kindred matters. He concluded by saying that for the present he feared Prior was indeed right, and that nothing could be done. As regards the laity, said Prior, nothing, not until we have a discipline which we can enforce with pains and penalties. How can a sheepdog work a flock of sheep unless he can bite occasionally as well as bark? But as regards ourselves we can do much. Prior's manner was strange throughout the conversation, as though he were thinking all the time of something else. His eyes wandered curiously over Ernest, as Ernest had often noticed them wander before. The words were about church discipline, but somehow or other the discipline part of the story had a knack of dropping out after having been again and again emphatically declared to apply to the laity and not to the clergy. Once indeed Prior had pettishly exclaimed, "Oh, bother the College of Spiritual Pathology." As regards the clergy, glimpses of a pretty large cloven hoof kept peeping out from under the saintly robe of Prior's conversation, to the effect that so long as they were theoretically perfect, practical peccadillos, or even peccadiccios, if there is such a word, were of less importance. He was restless, as though wanting to approach a subject which he did not quite venture to touch upon, and kept harping, he did this about every third day, on the wretched lack of definition concerning the limits of vice and virtue, and the way in which half the vices wanted regulating rather than prohibiting. He dwelt also on the advantages of complete unreserve, and hinted that there were mysteries into which Ernest had not yet been initiated, but which would enlighten him when he got to know them, as he would be allowed to do when his friends saw that he was strong enough. Prior had often been like this before, but never so nearly, as it seemed to Ernest, coming to a point, though what the point was he could not fully understand. His inquietude was communicating itself to Ernest, who would probably ere long have come to know as much as Prior could tell him, but the conversation was abruptly interrupted by the appearance of a visitor. We shall never know how it would have ended, for this was the very last time that Ernest ever saw Prior. Perhaps Prior was going to break to him some bad news about his speculations. Chapter 60. Ernest now went home and occupied himself till luncheon with studying Dean Alford's notes upon the various evangelistic records of the resurrection, doing as Mr. Shaw had told him, and trying to find out not that they were all accurate, but whether they were all accurate or no. He did not care which result he should arrive at, but he was resolved that he would reach one or the other. When he had finished Dean Alford's notes he found them come to this, namely, that no one yet had succeeded in bringing the four accounts into tolerable harmony with each other, and that the Dean, seeing no chance of succeeding better than his predecessors had done, recommended that the whole story should be taken on trust, and this Ernest was not prepared to do. He got his luncheon, went out for a long walk, and returned to dinner at 6:30. While Mrs. Jaw was getting him his dinner steak and a pint of stout, she told him that Miss Snow would be very happy to see him in about an hour's time. This disconcerted him, for his mind was too unsettled for him to wish to convert anyone just then. He reflected a little, and found that, in spite of the sudden shock to his opinions, he was being irresistibly drawn to pay the visit as though nothing had happened. It would not look well for him not to go, for he was known to be in the house. He ought not to be in too great a hurry to change his opinions on such a matter as the evidence for Christ's resurrection all of a sudden. Besides, he need not talk to Miss Snow about this subject today, There were other things he might talk about. What other things? Ernest felt his heart beat fast and fiercely, and an inward monitor warned him that he was thinking of anything rather than of Miss Snow's soul. What should he do? Fly, 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 it was the only safety. But would Christ have fled? Even though Christ had not died and risen from the dead, there could be no question that he was the model whose example we were bound to follow. Christ would not have fled from Miss Snow, he was sure of that, for he went about more especially with prostitutes and disreputable people. Now, as then, it was the business of the true Christian to call not the righteous but sinners to repentance. It would be inconvenient to him to change his lodgings, and he could not ask Mrs. Judd to turn Miss Snow and Miss Maitland out of the house. Where was he to draw the line? Who would be just good enough to live in the same house with him, and who just not good enough? Besides, where were these poor girls to go? Was he to drive them from house to house till they had no place to lie in? It was absurd. His duty was clear. He would go and see Miss Snow at once, and try if he could not induce her to change her present mode of life. If he found temptation becoming too strong for him, he would fly then. So he went upstairs with his Bible under his arm, and a consuming fire in his heart. He found Miss Snow looking very pretty in a neatly, not to say demurely, furnished room. I think she had bought an illuminated text or two, and pinned it up over her fireplace that morning. Ernest was very much pleased with her, and mechanically placed his Bible upon the table. He had just opened a timid conversation and was deep in blushes, when a hurried step came bounding up the stairs as though of one over whom the force of gravity had little power, and a man burst into the room saying, "I'm come before my time." It was Townley. His face dropped as he caught sight of Ernest. "What, you here, Pontifex? Well, upon my word." I cannot describe the hurried explanations that passed quickly between the three, enough that in less than a minute Ernest, blushing more scarlet than ever, slunk off, Bible and all, deeply humiliated as he contrasted himself and Townley. Before he had reached the bottom of the staircase leading to his own room, he heard Townley's hearty laugh through Miss Snow's door, and cursed the hour that he was born. Then it flashed upon him that if he could not see Miss Snow, he could at any rate see Miss Maitland. He knew well enough what he wanted now, and as for the Bible, he pushed it from him to the other end of his table. It fell over onto the floor, and he kicked it into a corner. It was the Bible given him at his christening by his affectionate aunt, Elizabeth Willoughby. True, he knew very little of Miss Maitland, but ignorant young fools in Ernest's state do not reflect or reason closely. Mrs. Baxter had said that Miss Maitland and Miss Snow were birds of a feather, and Mrs. Baxter probably knew better than that old liar, Mrs. Judd. Shakespeare says, "O opportunity, thy guilt is great, 'tis thou that execut'st the traitor's treason, thou set'st the wolf where he the lamb may get, whoever plots the sin, thou point'st the season, 'tis thou that spurn'st at right, at law, at reason, and in thy shady cell, where none may spy him, sits sin, to seize the souls that wander by him." If the guilt of opportunity is great, how much greater is the guilt of that which is believed to be opportunity, but in reality is no opportunity at all. If the better part of valor is discretion, how much more is not discretion the better part of vice? About 10 minutes after we last saw Ernest, a scared, insulted girl, flushed and trembling, was seen hurrying from Mrs. Judd's house as fast as her agitated state would let her, and in another 10 minutes 2 policemen were seen also coming out of Mrs. Judd's, between whom there shambled rather than walked our unhappy friend Ernest, with staring eyes, ghastly pale, and with despair branded upon every line of his face. Chapter 61. Pryor had done well to warn Ernest against promiscuous house-to-house visitation. He had not gone outside Mrs. Judd's street door, and yet what had been the result? Mr. Holt had put him in bodily fear, Mr. and Mrs. Baxter had nearly made a Methodist of him, Mr. Shaw had undermined his faith in the resurrection, Miss Snow's charms had ruined, or would have done so but for an accident, his moral character. As for Miss Maitland, he had done his best to ruin hers, and had damaged himself gravely and irretrievably in consequence. The only lodger who had done him no harm was the bellows mender, whom he had not visited. Other young clergymen, much greater fools in many respects than he, would not have got into these scrapes. He seemed to have developed an aptitude for mischief almost from the day of his having been ordained. He could hardly preach without making some horrid faux pas. He preached one Sunday morning when a bishop was at his rector's church, and made his sermon turn upon the question what kind of little cake it was that the widow of Zarephath had intended making when Elijah found her gathering a few sticks. He demonstrated that it was a seed cake. The sermon was really very amusing, and more than once he saw a smile pass over the sea of faces underneath him. The bishop was very angry, and gave my hero a severe reprimand in the vestry after service was over. The only excuse he could make was that he was preaching extempore, had not thought of this particular point till he was actually in the pulpit, and had then been carried away by it. Another time he preached upon the barren fig tree, and described the hopes of the owner as he watched the delicate blossom unfold, and give promise of such beautiful fruit in autumn. Next day he received a letter from a botanical member of his congregation who explained to him that this could hardly have been, inasmuch as the fig produces its fruit first and blossoms inside the fruit, or so nearly so that no flower is perceptible to an ordinary observer. This last, however, was an accident which might have happened to anyone but a scientist or an inspired writer. The only excuse I can make for him is that he was very young, not yet 24, and that in mind as in body, like most of those who in the end come to think for themselves, he was a slow grower. By far the greater part, moreover, of his education had been an attempt, not so much to keep him in blinkers as to gouge his eyes out altogether. But to return to my story. It transpired afterwards that Miss Maitland had had no intention of giving Ernest in charge when she ran out of Mrs. Judd's house. She was running away because she was frightened, but almost the first person whom she ran against had happened to be a policeman of a serious turn of mind, who wished to gain a reputation for activity. He stopped her, questioned her, frightened her still more, and it was he rather than Miss Maitland, who insisted on giving my hero in charge to himself and another constable. Towneley was still in Mrs. Judd's house when the policeman came. He had heard a disturbance, and going down to Ernest's room while Miss Maitland was out of doors, had found him lying, as it were, stunned at the foot of the moral precipice over which he had that moment fallen. He saw the whole thing at a glance, but before he could take action, the policeman came in and action became impossible. He asked Ernest who were his friends in London. Ernest at first wanted not to say, but Towneley soon gave him to understand that he must do as he was bid, and selected myself from the few whom he had named. "Writes for the stage, does he?" said Towneley. "Does he write comedy?" Ernest thought Towneley meant that I ought to write tragedy, and said he was afraid I wrote burlesque. "Oh, come, come," said Towneley, "that will do famously. I will go and see him at once." But on second thoughts he determined to stay with Ernest and go with him to the police court. So he sent Mrs. Judd for me. Mrs. Judd hurried so fast to fetch me, that in spite of the weather's being still cold she was giving out, as she expressed it, in streams. The poor old wretch would have taken a cab, but she had no money and did not like to ask Towneley to give her some. I saw that something very serious had happened, but was not prepared for anything so deplorable as what Mrs. Judd actually told me. As for Mrs. Judd, she said her heart had been jumping out of its socket and back again ever since. I got her into a cab with me, and we went off to the police station. She talked without ceasing. And if the neighbors do say cruel things about me, I am sure it ain't no thanks to him if they're true. Mr. Pontifex never took a bit of notice of me no more than if I had been his sister. Oh, it's enough to make anyone's backbone curdle. Then I thought perhaps my Rose might get on better with him, so I set her to dust him and clean him as though I were busy, and gave her such a beautiful clean new pinny, but he never took no notice of her no more than he did of me, and she didn't want no compliment neither. She wouldn't have taken not a shilling from him, though he had offered it, but he didn't seem to know anything at all. I can't make out what the young men are a-coming to. I wish the horn may blow for me and the worms take me this very night, If it's not enough to make a woman stand before God and strike the one half on 'em silly to see the way they goes on, and many an honest girl has to go home night after night without so much as a fourpenny bit and paying 3 and 6pence a week rent, and not a shelf nor cupboard in the place and a dead wall in front of the window. It's not Mr. Pontifex," she continued, "that's so bad, he's good at heart. He never says nothing unkind. And then there's his dear eyes. But when I speak about that to my Rose, she calls me an old fool and says I ought to be poleaxed. It's that prior as I can't abide. Oh, he likes to wound a woman's feelings, he do, and to chuck anything in her face, he do. He likes to wind a woman up and to wound her down." Mrs. Jupp pronounced wound as though it rhymed to sound. "It's a gentleman's place to soothe a woman, but he'd like to tear her hair out by handfuls. Why, he told me to my face that I was getting old indeed. There's not a woman in London knows my age except Mrs. Davis down in the Old Kent Road, and beyond a haricot vein in one of my legs I'm as young as ever I was. Old indeed. There's many a good tune played on an old fiddle. I hate his nasty insinuendos. Even if I had wanted to stop her, I could not have done so." She said a great deal more than I have given above. I have left out much because I could not remember it, but still more because it was really impossible for me to print it. When we got to the police station I found Townley and Ernest already there. The charge was one of assault, but not aggravated by serious violence. Even so, however, it was lamentable enough, and we both saw that our young friend would have to pay dearly for his inexperience. We tried to bail him out for the night, but the inspector would not accept bail, so we were forced to leave him. Townley then went back to Mrs. Jupp's to see if he could find Miss Maitland and arrange matters with her. She was not there, but he traced her to the house of her father, who lived at Camberwell. The father was furious and would not hear of any intercession on Townley's part. He was a dissenter, and glad to make the most of any scandal against a clergyman. Townley, therefore, was obliged to return unsuccessful. Next morning, Townley, who regarded Ernest as a drowning man, who must be picked out of the waters somehow or other if possible, irrespective of the way in which he got into it, called on me, and we put the matter into the hands of one of the best-known attorneys of the day. I was greatly pleased with Townley, and thought it due to him to tell him what I had told no one else. I mean that Ernest would come into his aunt's money in a few years' time, and would therefore then be rich. Townley was doing all he could before this, but I knew that the knowledge I had imparted to him would make him feel as though Ernest was more one of his own class, and had therefore a greater claim upon his good offices. As for Ernest himself, his gratitude was greater than could be expressed in words. I have heard him say that he can call to mind many moments, each one of which might well pass for the happiest of his life, but that this night stands clearly out as the most painful that he ever passed, yet so kind and considerate was Townley that it was quite bearable. But with all the best wishes in the world neither Townley nor I could do much to help beyond giving our moral support. Our attorney told us that the magistrate before whom Ernest would appear was very severe on cases of this description, and that the fact of his being a clergyman would tell against him. "Ask for no remand," he said, "and make no defense. We will call Mr. Pontifex's rector and you two gentlemen as witnesses for previous good character. These will be enough. Let us then make a profound apology and beg the magistrate to deal with the case summarily instead of sending it for trial. If you can get this, believe me, your young friend will be better out of it than he has any right to expect."